There are literally hundreds of different styles of feeders out there, different sizes, different materials, different designs. It can be a bit of a minefield. There's no surprising that if you're anything like me, that you've suddenly accumulated a stock of hundreds, if not thousands at home. But we often really only end up using the same style of feeder everywhere we go, to be honest. But obviously the feeders are designed in different ways to do different jobs. When you start looking at the specific design of each feeder, generally they are designed in a way, and that is something that, you know, it's quite important to understand if you're going to try and get the most out of your feeder fishing. Now, I carry lots of different styles of feeder. You know, we don't lose feeders like we used to. You know, you might only want to carry 2 or 3 of each, but the different designs, the different styles are designed in a particular way for each scenario that you might be faced with when you're out on the bank, no matter whether you're on commercials or natural venues. Now, my favorite style of feeder basically is a simple cage feeder. All right, now obviously this lends itself more towards silverfish fishing. You know, we're not really going to be looking at method feeders in this video. That's something for a different day. These are all styles of cage feeders and open-ended feeders. Now, the reason why I prefer this style of fishing for the vast majority of my fishing is for a couple of reasons. The first one is, as you can see, it's an actual cage feeder. So as the name suggests, it's a wire cage. Now, there are plastic cage feeders out there and there are wire cage feeders out there, you know, and there is a scenario for each style. Now, in this particular case, this is a fine wire cage feeder. Now, the reason why I like these is because when you've got large holes in a cage feeder like this, basically those holes are giving access for the water to start breaking your ground bait down when it's out there in the lake, okay? And obviously, while that's happening, it means that when you pick up to retrieve your feeder, if the water has got to the ground bait and it started breaking it down, it means that when you go to reel your feeder in, whether you've got a fish on or not, it's leaving the ground bait out there where your feeder landed. That is so important. And it's really something that really gets, it does get overlooked, and I've overlooked it a lot in the past. And one of the key reasons for that is basically because if you're using a ground bait that's not exiting the feeder, it's only really going to exit the feeder on the retrieve. Now, how many times have you been out there fishing and you might have gone to a venue where there's lots of fish there, and you start off the session and you're getting nice, lovely, clean bites from the outset. You catch 3, 4 in the first 3 or 4 casts. Everything's going really well, but then all of a sudden you start getting line bites, or you're getting little indications, or you're missing 1 or 2 bites, and that can often be the reason for that. Your first 2 or 3 casts, there's little food out there, there's just what you've put in there with your feeder, but over the course of those first 3 or 4 casts, particularly if you're getting a bite really quickly, because if you're getting bites quickly as soon as the feeder hits the bottom, well, the water's not getting a chance to get to your ground bait to start emptying the feeder for you. So it's not until you hook that fish and start reeling in that the feeder starts emptying. And what you can have is literally a trail of ground bait or a trail of bait coming back towards you. And that's why after a few casts, all of a sudden you're getting line bites, indications, and that's because you've got a trail of food coming back towards you, and those fish are then feeding across your line. So that can be a key problem if your ground bait's not exiting the feeder really quickly. So by having a fine wire, a fine cage like that, it basically means that the water's getting to the ground bait really quickly, so it's going to empty quicker. However, there are scenarios when you don't want that to happen. If you're fishing a venue like this one, for example, you might be faced with 12 feet of water, sometimes more. You don't want your ground bait breaking down too quickly, because there's a strong chance, depending on your mix and depending on the consistency, that the ground bait will be coming off the feeder as it's falling down through the water. And quite often we don't want that. We want the fish down on the bottom, and that is where a plastic feeder can come into its own. As you can see by that very, simple design, because of all this plastic here, that is protecting the ground bait from the water. So that means that the only place the water can really get to the ground bait is either end. So this feeder is going to hold on to the ground bait longer, and that is why we tend to use this style of feeder when we're fishing in deeper water, or if you really only want any of your bait to come out right on the bottom. If you don't want anything coming off the feeder, that is what that style of feeder is for. And this is also the style that we would use on rivers generally as well. You know, quite often when we're fishing faster flowing rivers, you want your bait to only exit the feeder when it's actually down on the bottom. That is where that style of feeder comes in, because you're focusing everything on the bottom. Now, the other scenario that a lot of people overlook is thinking about the bait that you're actually introducing through the feeder. Now you're probably wondering what I mean by that. Well, what I basically mean is that if you were feeding dead maggots, for example, like we've got here, we've got some dead maggots here. If we pop them in the ground bait, these are obviously dead, so they're not wriggling. When I load this feeder, they're not moving because they're dead. They will stay there. They will stay there for the cast. And that could be a great way of introducing dead maggots, particularly on venues like this, for roach, for skimmers, for silverfish, and for carp sometimes. But because those maggots aren't riddling, they're staying exactly where they are. Now, had I just done that with live maggots, literally within 5 seconds, those would be riddling out of that feeder. And depending on how quick you are at loading your feeder and casting out there, quite often you could have lost half of your maggots on the grass behind you or in the edge before you've even made the cast, because that style of feeder, there's virtually nothing there to stop those maggots wriggling out. So if you were using live maggots, maybe that style of feeder wouldn't be suited for that. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. And the other scenario is if you're going to use worms. Now, chopped worm, we all know how popular that is on venues. A nice dollop there of chopped worm. If I was to load this up into this feeder, for example, now I've only really lightly squeezed that, I haven't squeezed it too tight. As you can see, because the worms are obviously, they're wet, they're chopped, they're juicy, this style of feeder, literally, I can't squeeze that anymore now. Now, I honestly think that if I was able to cast that out there now, that would be breaking up on the way down, and so that might not be the kind of presentation you want. And the other issue as well is that if you wanted to feed lots of worms, watch what happens when I squeeze my finger and thumb there, watch. All of that bait is coming out through the actual wire, through the cage itself. So if you're faced with a scenario where you want to feed lots of particles, lots of live maggots, for example, lots of worm, this style feeder is not going to let you put a large volume of bait through each time. And that is where that style feeder might once again come into it. All right, so if I was to fill this with worm, for example, nice big healthy dollop of worm, as you can see, it's containing all those worms. So think very carefully about the style of feeder that you're going to be using. Think about the scenario and think about what you're trying to achieve as well. All right, because you might not want any food coming off your feeder on the way down, because if fish are up in the water where they naturally want to be, if they can pick off freebies at half depth and never go down to the bottom, you're not going to catch them, are you? Because that's where your hook bait is, down there. So you might need to have a plastic style feeder like that, just like a window. Window feeders do exactly the same sort of thing. They hold on to the bait. These were designed for introducing lots of particles, so you can literally scoop them into your bait and just lightly cap it off with ground bait. All right, so this is why we carry all these different styles of feeders. Now, whilst I've said that's my favorite style of feeder, there is one thing that can hinder you fishing with a feeder like that, and that is the range that you're going to cast it. Now, for me, the perfect presentation of a feeder out there on the bottom would be a side weighted feeder. So this is a cage feeder, but it's a side weighted, as the name suggests. It's got the weight on the side, so that sits on the bottom like that, and for me that's the perfect way of presenting a feeder. However, because of that style of design, you're limited as regards how far you can cast them. It's not the most aerodynamic shape, so whilst you might feel as though that is the perfect feeder you want to fish with out there, you might not be able to cast it out there. And this is where one of the things in feeder fishing that we have to do, and that is sometimes you've just got to compromise. Sometimes you've got to fish with a feeder that might not be presented perfectly on the bottom, but you might have to use a feeder that doesn't present the bait quite as well. But if that's the only feeder you can get there, then that's what you've got to do. You know, there's no point you presenting a feeder like that perfectly, even with the best bait, the best rig. If you're presenting it in a place where the fish aren't there, you know, then what's the point, you know? So sometimes you might have to switch to a weight forward feeder. There are lots and lots of different designs. As the name suggests, the weight is at the front. That is designed for cutting through the wind, much more aerodynamic. Sometimes you've got to fish with these just to get to where the fish are. Okay, the presentation might not be quite as good, but sometimes you've got to sacrifice that to get to where the fish are. It's something that I'm amazed, you know, how many times it actually gets overlooked, you know, and by just understanding the different designs and understanding the limitations of each design, you'll probably find that you're going to be able to present the bait out there where the fish are, but also use the feeder as a tool that's going to help you catch more fish. It's something that, you know, it's easy to overlook. There are loads of different designs out there, but just have a look at the design of your feeder, have a look at the baits that you're actually feeding, And you know, by using the feeder, you can also then look at something which I think is vastly overlooked, and that is the consistency of your ground bait. Now, we'll not talk too much about this because I think this probably warrants a video on its own, but basically the consistency of your ground bait is so important, and we've seen this even in a lineup. I've seen it when we've fished as a team, when we've practiced as a team, where we've all fished with the same mix, for example, and one angler in the middle has caught a completely different species from the anglers either side. We've fished virtually the same range, the same depth, the same ground bait, even the same baits, and that was purely down to the consistency of the ground bait. All right, so just think very carefully and believe that by changing the consistency of the ground bait, it can have a massive impact on your fishing. I've done it so many times. I've fished with a mix like that, a normal average damp mix, if you want to call it that, how most people would have a mix. I have literally switched to an over wet mix, which is like that. Obviously, you are limited to how wet you can have it, depending on the style of feeder that you're using, because if it's too wet, it's going to end up on the grass behind you when you cast in. But if you can get that consistency right with the right feeder, by creating a wet cloud, it's amazing how much just that wet cloud can draw fish down, and it really can affect the species that you're catching. Quite often we've seen with a drier mix, you tend to catch smaller fish, you might be catching roach, whereas with an over wet mix or a more inert mix, you can be catching skimmers and bream. And literally it can be that black and white, you know. That's something that may warrant its own video sometime, because it's something that, whilst I think a lot of people do overlook it, it's one of the things I love, because by using mixers like this one, for example, which is the F1 Natural, you've got the option. You can fish with it dry, you can fish with it damp, or you can over wet it. So it's almost like having 3 different ground baits all in one bowl, and that's something that you can constantly tweak throughout your session. It's something that's really fun to play with, and it's amazing how many times those key little details of the feeder and the consistency of your mix can completely transform your session.